Hello, and welcome to the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center's webinar, Inclusive Education for K through 12 Students with Mental Health Disabilities, Navigating Legal Rights and Best Practices under the ADA, IDEA, and Section 504. So at this time, I'm going to pass the mic over to our speaker today, Rebecca Raftery, with the Bazelon Center, and she will go ahead and start her presentation. So Rebecca, off to you.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you all for being here to join this presentation. As Emily mentioned, this is slide 13. My name is Rebecca Raftery. I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow with the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. Our mission at the Bazelon Center is to protect and advance the civil rights of adults and children with mental health and developmental disabilities. And before we start, I am a white woman with strawberry blonde hair wearing a black shirt. So as Emily mentioned earlier on, I will take questions at the end, so feel free to jot down any questions that come up as we go along, and then we'll take those at the end. Slide 14. So we'll start out today by discussing some objectives for the session. We'll discuss then what the world currently looks like for students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities in terms of school discipline, behavior, and special education placement. We will then talk about what the world could look like, what we're trying to achieve. We'll then turn to applicable laws and the right to inclusion. And then we'll discuss some best practices for supporting students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities to be included in the regular education classroom. And then at the end, I'll share out just a few resources and we'll take some questions. Slide 15. So our objectives for today include understanding the right to inclusive education for students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities under the applicable disability rights laws. And I'll be discussing next what I mean by mental health and behavior-related disabilities. We'll also be able to identify the legal responsibilities of schools in supporting students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities, including in school discipline matters. And finally, we'll learn best practices for supporting the inclusion of students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities. Slide 16. I just want to pause for a moment before we move forward and talk about the terminology that I'll be using today. I may be using the term mental health disability or student with a mental health disability. That's because I'm discussing legal protections under disability rights laws. Here, I'm referring to youth who have mental health diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, just to name a few. That's a non-exhaustive list. I may also use the term behavior-related disability or disability-related behavior. This is just to refer to disabilities that might not be mental health disabilities per se, but they might have behavior associated with the disability that impacts the student's learning. Much of this presentation will also focus on the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, the IDEA. And the IDEA, and I apologize in advance for all of the acronyms we'll use today, the IDEA has 13 categories of disabilities. The exact terms you hear in your state will vary, but these are the federal categories that I have listed here. And so I just wanted to take a moment to go through some of those. Those categories include autism, deafblindness, deafness and hearing impairment, emotional disturbance, which is sometimes abbreviated ED, and you might also hear emotional disability, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, and developmental delay. So you'll see that I have bolded a few of these categories. I've bolded autism, emotional disturbance, multiple disabilities, and other health impairment. That's because these are some of the common disability categories under the IDEA that students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities may qualify for services under. But this is not exclusive, and you should note that any child who's eligible to receive services under the IDEA, regardless of their disability category, may need and be entitled to behavior supports and other related services. I also, not to belabor our terminology, but for our future benefit, wanted to talk about what emotional disturbance or emotional disability means, because this is a common category that students with mental health diagnoses will receive services under. So the IDEA defines an emotional disability as a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period and adversely affecting the child's educational performance. A, inability to learn, not explained by intellectual, sensory, or other health factors. B, inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. C, inappropriate behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. D, general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. E, tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal school problems. So in this presentation, I may say students with ED as a shorthand, and that just means students who are qualified under the IDEA to receive special education based on that category. And then the last thing I'll note here is that other health impairment is just a broad category of other medical conditions that limit the child's strength, energy, or alertness, and that commonly includes ADHD. So you may hear ADHD and other health impairment together. Slide 17. So let's talk about what the world looks like now for students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities. Unfortunately, students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities are more frequently sent to special classes, separate schools, or alternative schools, or are referred to the criminal legal system through school. Students with ED in particular are more likely than any other subgroup of students with disabilities to face disciplinary removal from school. Students with ED are overrepresented in separate special education placements, which means they're sent to a separate school. So according to EDFACS data from the United States Department of Education, 3% of all students with disabilities are placed in separate schools, but 12% of students with emotional disturbance are placed in separate schools. So that means they're overrepresented compared to other subpopulations of students with disabilities. Slide 18. Students with disabilities are also overrepresented in exclusionary discipline. So that means suspensions, expulsions, and push out from the classroom. According to the most recent data by the US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which is from 2020 to 2021, students with disabilities make up 17% of the student population, but they account for 34% of students with one suspension, 36% of students with more than one suspension, and 21% of students who were expelled. So you can see that they're very overrepresented compared to the percentage that they represent in the total student population. We also know that Black students with disabilities in particular are even more disproportionately affected by exclusionary discipline. Slide 19. Schools may also call police in response to students' behavior instead of implementing positive behavior supports and appropriate crisis management. And because of that, students with disabilities are also overrepresented in referrals to law enforcement and school-based arrests. So according to that same recent data from the United States Department of Education, students with disabilities again make up 17% of the total student population, but they account for 27% of referrals to law enforcement and 28% of school-related arrests. Slide 20. So we've talked about what the world looks like now, but I want us to imagine what the world could look like. What are we aiming to achieve? And what could it be like for students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities in particular? So being educated in the general education classroom includes not being removed for disciplinary reasons related to behavior. So we'd like to see those statistics I just read go down and to see no overrepresentation of students with disabilities in that exclusionary discipline data. We also know that nearly all students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities can be educated in the general education setting if they have the right supports and services in place. We're going to talk later in the presentation more in depth about what some strategies for inclusion could look like, but just as a general overview, so you have a sense as we're starting to talk about the law, here are some strategies that may be effective. So one is working with families to identify students' strengths and needs, conducting thoughtful behavioral assessments and developing intervention plans, and also partnering with providers to develop creative mental health services. Slide 21. So let's talk about the applicable laws supporting inclusion. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and we're focusing here on Title II of the ADA. We also have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which I'll call Section 504 for short. These are both disability anti-discrimination laws. Section 504 also requires schools to provide equal opportunity to students with disabilities. For example, meeting the needs of a child with a disability the same as or as adequately as the school meets the needs of other children. And the ADA and Section 504 both apply to K-12 education, but they also apply more broadly than that. And then we also have the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, the IDEA, which focuses on K-12 schools and on a free, appropriate public education, a FAPE. So the IDEA in particular guarantees a FAPE to certain eligible students, and we'll talk about who those are in a moment. But these are the applicable laws that we're going to be talking about today. Slide 22. So to which schools do these laws apply? Note that I'm going to provide a somewhat pared down version or simplified version for our purposes here. So Title II of the ADA applies to state and local government entities. For our purposes, that is K-12 public schools, including public charter schools. Section 504 applies to entities that receive federal funding. So that includes all K-12 public schools, including public charter schools, and it also includes private or independent schools that receive federal funding. And then finally, the IDEA, that applies to all K-12 public schools, including public charter schools. Slide 23. So who qualifies? And I'm actually going to go through all of the animation here to show that this slide has a picture of two concentric circles. The larger outside blue circle is labeled Section 504, and a smaller red circle on the inside of it is labeled IDEA. And that's because Section 504 is generally broader than the IDEA in terms of who is covered by it. So only those students with disabilities whose disabilities interfere with their learning may be eligible for special education and related services under the IDEA. So that's a smaller group. And for students, basically all students with disabilities, I'll explain the definition in a moment, are captured by Section 504. So Section 504 protects more students than the IDEA. In terms of the exact definitions of who qualifies, under the IDEA, children ages 3 through 22 who have a disability that adversely affects their education and who require special education to make appropriate educational progress are protected by the IDEA. And under Section 504 and the ADA, apologies, too many acronyms, children who have a disability that substantially limits one or more major life activities and require reasonable modifications are protected by Section 504 and the ADA. You may also have heard of a 504 plan, and that comes from Section 504, and it's distinct from an IEP, which we'll discuss in a moment. Slide 24. So there is an explicit right to inclusion under each of those relevant laws that we were just discussing, and each is worded slightly differently, so we'll go through each one. The ADA has a right to the most integrated setting appropriate, and that comes from a Supreme Court case called Olmstead, which I'll go into a little bit more depth about in a moment. The ADA also provides for reasonable modifications to avoid disability discrimination. Under the IDEA, the inclusion mandate there is framed as the right to be educated in the least restrictive environment, which is sometimes abbreviated as LRE. And the IDEA provides a right to a free, appropriate public education, a FAPE, which includes specialized instruction, related services, and an IEP. Section 504 also provides for a right to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And it also provides for reasonable accommodations to avoid disability discrimination. As I mentioned, making sure that students with disabilities have an equal opportunity as compared to students without disabilities. The relevant regulation for Section 504 provides that there is a right for students with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent appropriate to the needs of the student with the disability. Slide 25, the Olmstead integration mandate. So here I'll go a little bit more in depth about that Supreme Court case that I was just discussing. So Olmstead versus LC was a Supreme Court case that was decided in 1999, and it was brought on behalf of Lois Curtis and thousands of other individuals with disabilities who had been denied the opportunity to live outside of an institution, despite a recommendation that they actually could live in the community and be served by community programs. So you'll see it's not an education-specific case, but it does interpret the ADA and therefore is applicable for our purposes here. The Supreme Court in Olmstead held that the ADA prohibits needless segregation of people with disabilities and that individuals with disabilities are entitled to live in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. So what is the most integrated setting appropriate? So that has been defined by regulation as a setting that enables individuals with disabilities to interact with non-disabled persons to the fullest extent possible. And there's been a recent 504 regulation released by the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's, again, not strictly applicable to education, but it does kind of further flesh out this idea of most integrated setting. And that regulation says that these settings provide opportunities to live, work, and receive services in the greater community, like individuals without disabilities. And they're located in mainstream society, offer access to community services and opportunities at times, frequencies, and with persons of an individual's choosing. And they afford individuals choice in their daily life activities. So again, that doesn't strictly apply to education, but it is helpful, I think, in understanding this concept of most integrated setting. Slide 26. So we've discussed a little bit the right to special education under the IDEA. And again, that's a right to a free, appropriate public education, a FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. Just to go a little bit more into what that looks like, that includes identification and evaluation of students with disabilities or students who are suspected to have a disability. It includes eligibility. And it also includes what many people are familiar with, I suspect, an individualized education program, or an IEP. An IEP also includes development of goals that are specific to a child's needs, and also a mechanism for monitoring progress towards those goals. It also includes specialized instruction in the areas that that individual child needs, related services, accommodations, and modifications as needed. Slide 27. So we've discussed least restrictive environment, the LRE, and all eligible children with disabilities under the IDEA have a right to receive special education services in the least restrictive environment. So to think about what this actually looks like, the least restrictive environment is a full-time general education classroom with whatever supports and services the child needs to access that classroom. The most restrictive environment would be a one-to-one instruction, so teacher and student. Typically, it would be in a hospital, a residential setting, or in a child's home. That would be most restrictive. Placement in the least restrictive environment should give the student the most contact with other children her age. That includes those with and without disabilities, while also meeting her educational needs. So it's an individualized inquiry, but it should be giving as much contact as possible with other children, which is why the most restrictive environment is a separate setting with just the student and the teacher, and the least restrictive environment is a full-time general education classroom. Slide 28. So this slide contains a photo of an inverted pyramid that shows a continuum of placements from less restrictive at the top of the inverted pyramid, the largest chunk of it, which says general education with supplementary aids and services. And then all the way at the bottom is the most restrictive part, which is residential, home, and hospital setting. And this is just one way of demonstrating the least restrictive environment principle. So I'll go through the inverted pyramid from least restrictive to most restrictive. So as I mentioned, least restrictive would be the general education classroom with supplementary aids and services. The next rung down on the pyramid is separate classes. So the student might be in a school with lots of other students, both with and without disabilities, but they might take some classes separately just with other students with disabilities, but they still might have their extra or their special classes like music and art. Maybe some of their academic classes would be with both students with and without disabilities, but then they'd have some classes separately with just students with disabilities. The next more restrictive setting from there is a separate special education day school. So the statistics that I was providing in the beginning about placement of students with ED, those statistics were saying that students with ED are more likely to be sent to a separate school. And that means students with disabilities are with only other students with disabilities in their school. They don't have opportunities to interact with non-disabled peers at school. More restrictive than that is a residential school that takes the student away from their home and is also all students with disabilities. And then the most restrictive setting, as I mentioned, would be home or a hospital setting where the instruction is just one-on-one with a teacher and a student. They don't have any opportunity to interact with any peers. So the IDEA says that children with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And this might be familiar because Section 504 says the same thing. The IDEA also says that there is a presumption in favor of inclusion. So removal of children with disabilities from the general education environment should occur only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So essentially, we should be presuming that the child can be educated in the general education setting. We should only remove them from that setting if the nature or severity of their disability is such that they can't be accommodated in the regular education setting. Slide 29. So I want to pause here and give a warning that a lot of law is coming. I'm going to do my best to break it down slowly and clearly, but just wanted to let you know. So we're going to talk now about what special education law says about behavior supports and school discipline. And here on this slide 29, it's specifically related to Section 504. So the U.S. Department of Education in July of 2022 released some guidance about Section 504 and what it says in regards to behavior supports and school discipline. And I highly recommend checking that out. It will also be, it's at this link on this slide, but it's also in my resources section at the end of our presentation. So this guidance clarifies that Section 504 independently requires schools to provide behavioral supports and services to students with disabilities who need them to have a FAPE, so to be able to access their education equally to students without disabilities. This guidance also outlines how Section 504's requirement to provide a FAPE applies to long-term disciplinary sanctions, such as out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. It also explains Section 504's general non-discrimination requirements in the context of discipline, which applies to school staff and to the conduct of contractors, such as security staff or school police. And finally, it makes clear that Section 504 requires schools to provide reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures when that's necessary to avoid discrimination. So that could include school discipline policies. Slide 30. What does the IDEA say about behavior supports and school discipline? So for this next section, we'll be focusing on some specific parts of the IDEA that relate to behavior supports and to school discipline. There are additional protections under the IDEA for students with disabilities related to behavior and school discipline, and these limit the amount of time that students with disabilities who are eligible for the services under the IDEA can be removed from their special education placement. And this law also provides additional procedural safeguards, which we'll talk about. So first, IEP teams, which include teachers, parents, other providers who work with the student, they must consider the use of positive behavioral interventions to address the behavior of any eligible student under the IDEA whose behavior impedes their learning or that of others. And then, as I alluded to, the IDEA also provides special school discipline protections for eligible students with disabilities. And we'll go through each of these, and this is where all of the law comes in. So these include the manifestation determination review requirement, and then what I call the 10-day rule and the 45-day rule. And we'll go through each one slowly, but if any questions come up, please write them down and we will discuss them at the end. Slide 31. The 10-day rule. The IDEA says that when a child with an IEP violates a school rule, so for example, some code of conduct rule, like wearing a uniform or whatever school rules there might be, the school can remove the child from his or her special education placement, meaning his or her school, for up to 10 school days without having to take any special disciplinary steps. And those 10 school days can be cumulative or consecutive. Again, IEP teams should be proactively discussing positive interventions when they know that a child has challenges with behavior. If the school wants to remove the child for more than 10 school days, then something called a manifestation determination review, or MDR meeting, must be held. The purpose of the MDR is to decide whether the rule violation was caused by the child's disability or the school's failure to implement an IEP, or if it was completely unrelated to the child's disability or the IEP. Slide 32. So the manifestation determination review meeting must be held within 10 school days of the removal. And when I say removal, it usually means suspension, but it could be expulsion or some other attempt to remove the child from school, even informal removals. The manifestation determination, that decision is made by the IEP team, which includes parents. The team has to consider all relevant information, including whether the child can understand and control her behavior, and whether the IEP is appropriate. The IDEA says that the behavior is a manifestation of the disability if it is either caused by or substantially related to the child's disability, or if it's a direct result of the school's failure to implement the IEP. So if the school hasn't been providing the specialized instruction or the related services such as counseling, and that has caused this behavior, then that would also be considered a manifestation of the disability. Slide 33. So if the IEP team, after holding that manifestation determination meeting, decides that the behavior is a manifestation of the child's disability, then the child must be immediately returned to her IEP placement, meaning her school, and she cannot be disciplined further for that incident. So let's say the school attempted to suspend a student for 15 days, but then within 10 school days of the suspension, the IEP team met and they determined actually this was a manifestation of her disability. Then immediately the suspension ends and she goes back to her school and she cannot face any further discipline for that disability-related incident. The school must also then conduct a functional behavioral assessment and write a behavior intervention plan or review a current plan if one exists to make sure that the behavior doesn't happen again. And I will explain in a moment what a functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan are. Also, if the IEP team determines that the IEP is inappropriate or if it's not being implemented, then the school must take immediate steps to fix the problem. Slide 34. So if the IEP team after that manifestation determination meeting decides that the behavior is not a manifestation of the disability, then the child can be disciplined as a child without a disability would be disciplined. Excuse me. So that means that if the behavior is determined not to be a manifestation, then ordinary school discipline rules apply. Whatever would apply to any other student is applicable to this student with a disability. The only difference is that a child with a disability in this situation must continue to receive the specialized instruction and related services provided in her IEP, even though it might be in a different setting. So for instance, if the child is suspended for 15 days, after that 10th day, once the manifestation determination is triggered, even if it's not a manifestation, the child must still get special education and related services, even if they're at home or in a different setting. Slide 35. So now I'm going to talk about some special circumstances where students can be removed for a longer period of time from their special education placement. The IDEA provides for a special set of circumstances where even if the child's behavior was determined to be a manifestation of their disability, they can actually be removed from their special education placement for up to 45 days. So even though I just said that if the behavior was a manifestation, they have to be returned to their placement, this is a special set of circumstances, a narrow set of circumstances, where they actually can still be removed for a longer period of time. And these are three very specific scenarios. So first is if the child has a weapon at school or a school function. Second is if the child possesses illegal drugs at school or a school function. And third is if the child seriously injures another person at school or a school function. Slide 36. So in those cases, the school must send the child to an alternate setting for that 45-day period. And they again must continue to receive specialized instruction and related services per their IEP. Again, the IEP team, which includes parents, will decide together what that alternative setting will be. Sometimes it will be a different school. Sometimes it will be services provided at home or somewhere else. But the IEP team will make that decision together. The school still has to hold a manifestation determination meeting within 10 school days of removing the child from her placement. But the child then will stay in the alternative setting for 45 school days, regardless of whatever the decision from the manifestation determination was. Slide 37. So there's another special circumstance that can lead to a long-term removal of a student with a disability. And that is if a school believes that maintaining the child's current placement is substantially likely to result in injury to the child or others, the school can request a due process hearing seeking a 45-day change in placement. And that would be only if the hearing officer in that due process hearing orders the change in placement. So the school would have to sort of petition to be able to remove a student outside of those narrow circumstances that I just read for 45 days. Slide 38. So we've heard now about the discipline laws and the protections for students with disabilities. So in particular, that will apply when a student has disability-related behavior that leads to some kind of school rule violation that a school may try to discipline a student for. But ideally, we're preventing that kind of behavior before it happens. And so we'll now take a brief look at some best practices for supporting and including students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities. And again, the goal is to make sure that students can be included in the general education classroom to the maximum extent appropriate, and that we're providing the right types of supports and services for students. And I'll just say this is definitely not an exhaustive list, so we're just going to go through a few ideas, but there's much more out there, and I'll refer you to some resources for more information. Slide 39. So what are some behavior strategies that an IEP team can proactively implement? One is conducting a functional behavior assessment, an FBA, to understand the function of behaviors. And I promise I will be explaining that in more detail soon. Another is including a behavior intervention plan, sometimes called a BIP or a BIP, in the student's IEP. Also including social, emotional, or behavioral goals in the IEP, providing the student accommodations in the classroom, and also providing related services in or out of the classroom. Slide 40. So I mentioned that we would be discussing FBAs, and we've discussed that the IDEA entitles some students to FBAs. For example, if they're removed for behavior that is determined to be a manifestation of their disability, then the school is required to conduct an FBA. But FBAs can also be done at any time, so they should be done whenever a child has challenging behavior and it needs to be addressed. An FBA should be conducted. We think of all behavior as communication. So an FBA should be helping us to figure out what is being communicated by the challenging behavior that we want to address. What is the need that's underlying that behavior? What might be reinforcing the behavior in the environment, whether that's intentional or unintentional. So an FBA is a process for gathering data on behavior to determine when, where, and why a student exhibits a behavior. So sometimes, probably any of us who've dealt with other people have sometimes experienced behavior that feels like it comes out of nowhere. You don't understand why that person reacted the way that they did, but we think there's always a reason. There's always some kind of need or communication need underlying that behavior. So this is to help us kind of figure out what is going on. The purpose of an FBA is, once we have access to that data, to be able to understand what the need is and to teach and reinforce acceptable alternatives, which we call replacement skills, while we're also decreasing or eliminating the behaviors that we're labeling problem behaviors. So things that might take a child otherwise out of class. And an FBA should include multiple different components. It should include evaluations, interviews with parents, teachers, and the student, rating scales, and observations. And I have ABCs on the slide, and that stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So the antecedent is the thing that might be occurring before the behavior. It might be something that you don't even realize is going on. The B stands for behavior. What is the actual behavior we're witnessing? And C stands for consequence. What is the thing that's happening after the behavior? So, and it may be unintentionally or intentionally reinforcing that behavior. And that's an important component of the data collection. So the outcome, at the end of the FBA, we should have a summary of the behaviors, when the behaviors occur. That could be time of day, but it could also be the class or other specifics about the schedule, maybe after lunch versus before lunch. Could also be what is the antecedent. That's another type of when. And also, what are the outcomes, the consequences that are reinforcing the behaviors? It should have data that supports that summary, and it should be able to provide the basis for a behavior intervention plan. Slide 41. So the IDEA does not define requirements for an FBA, but generally at a minimum, an FBA should clearly define target behaviors. It should be very specific so that it's really easy to tell, did the behavior happen or not? It shouldn't be something vague because that's harder to keep track of. It should also collect both direct and indirect data on the occurrence and non-occurrence of behavior. So what I mean by that, direct data would be observational. So someone actually observing the behavior and keeping data on that. Indirect data would be like surveys or interviews with teachers and parents, not the actual direct observation. And we want to be looking at both the occurrence of the behavior, when is it happening and what is happening, but also non-occurrence of the behavior. When the behavior is not happening, what's going on? Because that provides important data too. And then we should be analyzing data to determine trends and to develop hypotheses as to the function of each behavior. So I mentioned that behavior is serving a need or a function, and we need to have hypotheses about what that is so that we can try to address it. And again, it should lead to the development or the revision of a behavior intervention plan, which I'll get to next. Slide 42. A behavior intervention plan, so again, sometimes abbreviated as BIP or BIP, should be individualized and specific to the child. It should include interventions based on data collection, and it should be monitored, evaluated, and revised as needed. So this isn't like you do it one time and then you're done. You have to keep going because hopefully we're teaching replacement skills, we're teaching, we're taking approaches that will reduce the problem behavior, but then different behaviors might happen, or we need to continue to address what's going on. And so there should be continuous data collection, monitoring, and revision of both the behavior intervention plan and the FBA. And this is an example of when a student has a behavior that is determined to be a manifestation. The law says that if the child already has a behavior intervention plan, that needs to be revised because clearly it's not addressing that target behavior. Slide 43. So just as we can have academic IEP goals that relate to things like reading and writing, students with disabilities, with mental health and behavior-related disabilities may also need social, emotional, or behavioral goals. They may need to be explicitly taught and working on goals in those areas. So these would include improving social emotional skills and/or reducing unwanted behaviors as well. These goals should be specific and measurable. So there should be a way to tell objectively whether the student has met that goal or not, or what their progress towards meeting that goal has been. They should identify the exact behavior or emotional skill to be addressed. They should also be reasonable. So can the child actually accomplish this in 1 year? And it really needs to be individualized to where that child is now. And then again, I've kind of talked about replacement behaviors. It should identify an acceptable replacement behavior. So instead of just saying the child, student X will not call out, it could say something like student X will raise her hand. That way we're focusing on the positive, acceptable replacement behavior, not just what we don't want them to do. Slide 44. So students with mental health and behavior-related disabilities may also need changes to the learning environment or accommodations that change the how of learning. They allow the child to access the content, but it's the same content. They should be also individualized to the student, and they can really be creative. We're just trying to think of what this particular child needs in order to access the content. Some examples, again, this is a non-exhaustive list, would include positive reinforcement or praise, sensory stimulation, which could be something like sitting on a bounce ball or sitting on a seat cushion. It could include having a stress ball or a fidget toy, frequent breaks, frequent prompts or reminders, checklists, rephrasing of directions, and frequent checks for understanding. The U.S. Department of Education guidance has also strongly encouraged schools to consider how behavioral supports within the IEP could be facilitated through a school-wide positive behavior support system that is for all students. And these shouldn't just be listed in the IEP. It's not just to make a nice list on a document that doesn't get used. These accommodations really should be consistently implemented by all adults that come into contact with the student at school. And the same goes for a behavior intervention plan. It's very important that the use of that plan is consistent across all environments. Slide 45. So I've also talked a bit about related services, and there are many types of related services that might be helpful for students with mental health disabilities. Some direct interventions, which would be directly with the student, could include skills training. So for example, social skills training, training in developing positive relationships, explicit teaching of self-management strategies or restorative practices. Could also include mentoring. It could include individual or group counseling, and counseling could even focus on a specific area. So it could be a small group counseling series of sessions that focus on things like trauma or loss, sexual abuse, PTSD, whatever specific issues may be effective and indicated for certain students to focus on. Direct interventions can also include crisis intervention. So it could include responding to crises and having kind of that management plan in place. It could also include youth mobile crisis response teams. And these are all direct interventions that are done directly with the student. Slide 46. Mental health related services can also include kind of indirect interventions such as teacher coaching and training. So for example, training teachers or other staff on how to collect behavior data, how to put together an effective plan, and how to provide positive behavior supports in the classroom. Could also include parent coaching and training. So as I mentioned, for behavior intervention plans, it's often really important that those are implemented across settings. And so parent coaching could be really important for some students to make sure they're getting the same thing at home that they're getting at school. Mobilizing community resources is another form of related service. And so this could include things like counseling, mentoring that students have outside of school, recreation, employment experiences. And then also really important and underutilized in my experience is coordinating with non-school providers. So really all of these people who interact with the student, like doctors, mental health providers, counselors, mentors, all of those people have really important information and data about the student and also frequently see the student. And so it's really important for all of those people to be at the table collaborating about how to put together, for example, an effective behavior support plan, how to respond to crises. And this is another aspect of a related service that the school can be providing, is that coordination piece. So I wanted to provide some resources, and this is a very small list. This is slide 47. But I've included here some resources from the U.S. Department of Education that I find particularly helpful in thinking through what the legal rights are and also what some sort of best practices are in this area. So the first one is Positive Proactive Approaches to Supporting Children with Disabilities, a Guide for Stakeholders. That's from July 2022. All of these got put out sort of at the same time, and that's from the U.S. Department of Education's OSERS, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. Then there is a very helpful question and answer guide from the U.S. Department of Education as well. And that goes through some common questions about the rights of students with disabilities under the IDEA, specifically in terms of behavior and school discipline. So that is a really helpful one if you're finding yourself with a question. Oftentimes my questions are answered there. And then there's also a really helpful Dear Colleague letter, which is a little bit older, but discusses inclusion of behavioral supports in IEPs and also talks about the right to inclusion for students with mental health and behavior related disabilities. So I highly recommend checking that out as well. On slide 48, there's one more resource from the Department of Education, which is all about supporting students with disabilities and avoiding discriminatory use of student discipline under Section 504. And this is the one that I referred to in an earlier slide. So also highly recommend checking that out because it really details more of Section 504's reach and how that applies. And then I've included two resources from the Bazelon Center. One is about replacing school police with services that work. So sort of tangentially related to some of the issues we've been talking about, that schools often respond to behavior with things like exclusionary discipline and police rather than the types of interventions we would like to see. And then I also have a fact sheet, which is just a few years older, but still relevant on effective mental health services that can be integrated with schools. Thank you all so much for your attention. This has been such a great opportunity. I've really appreciated getting to present to you all. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Emily, and we're going to take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was awesome. So we definitely have some questions. So I'm going to start here with the first one that I see. We have a question about IEP teams. So the question is, can a primary teacher be considered part of an IEP team if they have not attended any IEP meetings, even though the prior written notice states their participation?
That's a tricky question. Thank you for the question. In theory, any primary teacher could be part of an IEP team, right? Like IEP teams should include teachers who interact with the student on a daily basis and who know about the student. And there should be multiple teachers if the student has multiple teachers. I would definitely say if the prior written notice or any meeting notice indicates that a teacher was there who wasn't there, you may want to, if you're a parent, or part of that team, you may want to ask to have that indicated. There should be a teacher, a special education teacher, as well as a general education teacher at every IEP team meeting. And families and students do have rights under FERPA to have records amended. So I would definitely recommend making sure that those records are accurate. You can also reach out to the teacher and try to make sure that they will come to the next meeting because they probably do have a lot of important information about the child to share. Hope that answers the question.
All right, the next question. This is, let's see, about the behavior intervention plan. So what steps should I take if I discovered that a behavior intervention plan, BIP, was developed for this individual and at his elementary school, but was never shared with the person, the parent, or toggled in the Maryland's online IEP system for the middle school? This oversight led to the middle school being unaware of the BIP, which of course impacted the person's education, as evidenced by his failure in core classes and an incident that led to his suspension.
Thank you. That's a really tricky issue that I see frequently with transfers between schools, whether that's, elementary to middle school, but also some students just transfer from school to school. Definitely parents have a right to have access to that information, especially if they've requested it. So they should be able to get a copy of that. I would also say you should just share it as soon as you have permission to do so. Depends on what your role is, of course, because we know that obviously, as we've talked about today, behavior intervention plans are really important in both the social emotional functioning of a student, but also in their ability to access academic content. So for example, if a suspension happens and there was no behavior intervention plan in place, depending on the length of the suspension, if it's long enough or if there have been enough of them to cause a manifestation determination review, that type of information at a manifestation determination meeting would be really important because that's basically an example of either the IEP being inappropriate or not being implemented, which is, as we've said, is a manifestation then under the law. So definitely think as soon as you have permission to share that, you should be sharing it because we want the student to be successful and we need to have a behavior intervention plan in place, it sounds like, for that student.
Great. We can squeeze another one or two in here. Question about social emotional support needs. If I have a child If my child had social emotional support needs, do I have to purchase the Common Corner kits or peanut ball? Can I request that with his IEP?
It sounds like I'm not familiar with the first, was it Common Corner?
Yeah, Common Corner kits.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with what that is, but both of those sound like they would be accommodations for the student.
Mhm.
And if the student needs those things in order to access the content, then that is an accommodation that the school is required to provide under the IDEA. So assuming your child has already been deemed eligible for services, that's something you could bring up to the IEP team, and you can always request an IEP meeting at any point if that's something that you think it would be helpful to talk about. You shouldn't have to pay for those out of your pocket. If they're being used at school, the school should be providing them.
Right, exactly. And how is documentation tracked to ensure what is listed in the IEP is actually happening?
It's a great question.
Mhm.
For related services that are billed sometimes through Medicaid, for example, counseling, there should be a service tracker where anytime the counselor has met with the student, they should be logging that they met with the student. It may include information about what they talked about or what strategies were employed. So you can always request a service tracker for related services. For things like specialized instruction and accommodations, it can be a little bit harder to tell on a day-to-day basis, but you should be able to request that information if you're worried that it's not being provided. In theory, you should be able to ask for a log, or you could even ask for a parent-teacher communication log if there are things that you think you need to address with teachers, or that can be helpful for being consistent across school and home environments. So that can be one way you can have teachers sign off to make sure that the special education teacher was there, for example. I think if you have concerns about specific accommodations, you can definitely ask about that. And then depending on the age of the student, they can also provide you with some information about what's going on sometimes. And students can also be advocating for their accommodations, although they shouldn't have to be, obviously.
Mhm. That's great. I know there are some other questions, and I don't think we're going to get to them, unfortunately. But Rebecca, I do see here on this slide 49, I think it is, that you did provide your email. Is it okay to go ahead and have people? Because I know, again, there's some great questions, and I hate that we kind of ran out of time. And I was hoping that maybe they could just contact you directly with these questions. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Happy to take any questions that folks have. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is Rebecca, REBECCAR, @bazelon.org, and it's here on the screen.
Perfect. So I'd encourage you to those that wrote in some questions for us. I again apologize, we ran out of time, but do send your questions directly to Rebecca so she can answer those questions for you and provide any support that you may need through the Bazelon Center. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out to the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center at 1-800-949-4232, or you can always email us at adainfo@transcend.org. So I want to say thank you so much, Rebecca, for presenting today. This was awesome. I know I learned a lot today, and it was some great information that you shared. Very thorough, some great resources, and we so appreciate you joining us today. So thank you.
Thank you.